Fear is the path to the dark side.
The battle over the role of government in our lives is still being fought. But those on the left have taken racism as a smear campaign against small government-loving Tea Partiers in Congress. In fact, one liberal journalist was recently quoted as saying, quote, "We can draw a straight line from the Confederacy to the Dixiecrats to today's Tea Party Republicans." Here now to fire back against the absurd idea that small government principles go hand in hand with racism is Jack Hunter, a columnist for the American Conservative magazine. Jack, welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Good to be with you, Judge.
Jack, what is this argument? What are the lefties saying is racist about the Tea Parties, and what kind of nonsense is it?
Well, the lefties, I remember Rachel Maddow saying on the 150th anniversary of the Civil War that was commemorated earlier this month, trying to tie the Tea Partiers in their attempts to nullify Obamacare to sort of slavery and racism.
It's remarkable 150 years after the start of the Civil War is how right now, so many of the hallmarks of the Civil War and of the Confederacy are in political fashion again. Senator John C. Calhoun, the beloved pro-slavery politician who was South Carolina's greatest political export at that time. He had been Vice President of the United States, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and as well as being a rabid proponent of slavery, John Calhoun, to that end, championed the cause of nullification. Nullification, the idea that states could and should refuse to follow federal laws they didn't like, that they thought went beyond the powers of the federal government. John Calhoun was seen by the secessionists as a hero and a guiding light in South Carolina, and his nullification cause inspired lots of anti-U.S. militancy there. Anti-U.S. militancy that led to cannons firing on Fort Sumter on this day 150 years ago, the start of the Civil War. It's not just anti-federal health reform legislation. It's legislation that says that federal law doesn't apply here in our state. But it's not just health reform. A conservative group called the 10th Amendment Center has been pushing a lot of the anti-health reform stuff. But they put that in the context of nullification, and they're pushing for other kinds of nullification, too. They're also, for example, proposing nullification of things like food safety laws and gun laws. In the state of Georgia, for example, Republicans are pushing the Georgia Food Freedom Act. Food freedom? Yeah, it would exempt the state of Georgia from federal regulations on the safety of the food supply. In Arizona, the state Senate there approved a bill exempting products from interstate commerce laws if they are made and used within Arizona. West Virginia attempting to do something similar, nullifying federal regulations on guns as long as those guns are made and used within West Virginia. Kentucky trying to nullify federal laws regarding environmental safety. They are trying to proclaim themselves a sanctuary from the Environmental Protection Agency. Your federal laws don't apply here, Yankees. United States, Schmoonited States. Nullification is back.
It's the same old liberal bugaboo about anything that has to do with Jeffersonian decentralist concepts. What I would ask a liberal like Rachel Maddow, who denounces nullification or secession and all these other things, is, considering that some of the earliest acts of nullification in this country were in defiance of the Fugitive Slave Act, in which states resisted federal law when escaped slaves would escape to free states. They were required by federal law to be returned to their masters. Right. Well, Wisconsin, some other northern states resisted this. Would Rachel Maddow have supported, because she opposes nullification, and in each and every instance, would she have supported taking those escaped slaves and giving them back to their masters because the federal government told her to do so?
Yankee laws, they're no good here either. All that is old, all that is Civil War era is new again in today's politics. It is all. The Confederacy and its politics are in fashion again, 150 years on.
But yet, because individual states like Wisconsin and Virginia want to nullify the federal regulation of health care, this person you're talking about, who must work for some lesser cable channel, is suggesting that the motivation has to be racist. I mean, there is a disconnect there. We're talking about the federal government interfering in an area that the Constitution itself has reserved for the states. And as you just explained, we're talking about historical examples which have been resistant of slavery and counter to racism.
That's precisely my point. The left wants to tie concepts like nullification or even secession, if you wanted to go that radical a route, to slavery, racism, segregation.
Joining us now is Melissa Harris Perry, MSNBC contributor and associate professor of politics and African American studies at Princeton University. Professor Harris Perry, thank you for being with us. So why are these Confederate themes resonating so much today?
I think we'd be foolish to imagine that this is uncorrelated with having an African American president. Certainly the revival of notions of the Confederacy track pretty closely with any sort of visible gains in African-American civil rights, in African-American equality, and even when in a moment like this we don't see huge gains in equality for African-Americans overall, the symbol of the black president and the first family is a very powerful one. He literally embodies the American state now in a black body. And so for the sort of Confederate mindset, which exists, by the way, not just in the South, as you said, but the Confederate mindset that infiltrates throughout the U.S., that is a very anxiety-producing moment that brings up all of these unresolved sort of political, cultural. I want to point out that even in the moment of the Civil War, I think we can see some parallels here to what people's real interests were. Remember that the planter class, the Southern elite that benefited from slave labor, was quite distinct from, poor and rural agrarian whites who didn't benefit from it. And yet, through the creation of a kind of racialized Confederate identity that cloaked itself in this notion about big federal government, they were able to create a coalition where people's economic interests actually didn't cohere, but their racial interests did, and you could overlay on that this kind of ideology about big. So seeing that happen again in a moment where people's economic interests might actually be in having health care, for example, but where you can produce an anxiety that there are these others, African Americans, new Latino immigrants, who are going to take something from them. You actually produce these weird coalitions where people work against their own interests.
If we're talking about race and absolutely hear you there. Melissa Harris Perry of Princeton University and MSNBC, thank you as always for your time. Really helpful.
Slavery, racism, segregation, it always must be about that, including today with the Tea Party wanting to nullify things like Obamacare, having these discussions. Because the left's historical narrative is collectivist in its nature. And what I mean by that, from FDR to Barack Obama, they consider the centralization of power in the federal government human liberation and political liberalization. That's what they seek. So anything that decentralizes power, they must get rid of and must denounce immediately. Nullification, therefore, is racist in each and every instance. So it's anything that has to do with decentralizing power. It's ridiculous.
Can we decentralize power? Can we reverse the flow of power, which has gone from the states and from individuals to the federal government, back to the states and to individuals as the Constitution mandates?
Not only can we, but we already are. Let's look at the situation in California, which wants to have medicinal marijuana. Well, we have a federal war on drugs in this country, in which they say, no, California, you can't do that. What do we have in that state? De facto nullification. I would ask a leftist like Rachel Maddow, does she agree that federal law is always supreme, that states have no rights whatsoever, that nullification is uniquely evil? Would she support going in and arresting people who, I don't know, are stricken with cancer or glaucoma, who choose to use medicinal marijuana to alleviate their pain? I suspect her answer would be no, but that's another one of the contradictions the left has to contend with when they say that nullification is racist or decentralizing power is inherently for slavery. And it's a contradiction they are they certainly don't want to jump head first into.
Got it. Jack Hunter, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.